Hi, it's Jennifer Isom-Schmidtke, and today I'll be talking about stress, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise known as PTSD. Walter Cannon of the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion was the one who first introduced the concept of psychological stress. He borrowed it from engineering, where it was used to describe the effects of physical forces on mechanical structures. So in the case of humans, it metaphorically describes the internal psychological and physiological effects of external forces. This thing that we call stress for humans can be thought of in two ways. As something that's external, and in that case we call it a stressor, and that includes environmental conditions that make unusual demands on an organism, a human, such as a dangerous or threatening situation, the experience of failure, or bereavement. Stress can also be thought of as something internal, and if it's internal stress, we refer to it as the stress response. And the stress response is your psychological and physiological response to stressors. The second definition of stress turns out to be the most important one because researchers are beginning to realize that the effects of stress on your body have way more to do with your perception of a stressor as being negative and harmful than the stressor itself in the long run. In fact, many researchers now think that simply the perception that stress is harmful to you in the long run can lead to death. Historically, when stressors appeared, they were infrequent and they were resolved quickly. And in that case, the stress response worked really well. For example, if you were faced with a lion on the African savanna, the stress response would kick in and it would enable you to run quickly for safety or to have enough energy to fight off that attack. And it would be over relatively quickly. And afterward, you would either not be around anymore or you would be returning to a calm and relaxed homeostatic state relatively quickly. However, our modern world presents stressors potentially multiple times a day, and these stressors can often last for days and weeks instead of minutes. So as a result, our stress response has become almost chronically activated. It really rarely has a chance to return to that calm and relaxed homeostatic state, and this can lead to serious health consequences. I'll talk about those next. So when faced with a stressor, our bodies react with a very adaptive and what's supposed to be a temporary response. And you can think of the stress response as having two complementary parts. So one has immediate effects, and the other takes a couple of minutes to kick in, but it is longer lasting. Now both parts are set in motion by the hypothalamus at the same time. So initially, the amygdala reacts to a stressor by alerting the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus gets the message and, in turn, activates the sympathetic nervous system, the mechanisms that we need for fight or flight to protect and ensure our survival. In fight or flight, the nerve endings of the sympathetic nervous system release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epinephrine is released by nerve endings in the adrenal gland, and norepinephrine is released by sympathetic nerve endings in the rest of the body. Now, these two neurotransmitters provide immediate and quick action to meet our stressor and to engage in the fight or flight response. Here's a visual of the nerves and the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic branches. The sympathetic branch on the right is the one that is activated during the stress response. So when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your heart will accelerate. The bronchi of your lungs will dilate so that you can get more oxygen into your bloodstream. Glucose is made available for energy, and epinephrine is released from the adrenal cortex, and norepinephrine is released from the other sympathetic nerve endings to speed your responses. Now, after the stressor is over, the parasympathetic nervous system, the one on the left, kicks in to calm and relax and to bring you back to homeostasis. The second part of the stress response, the part that is a bit slower to kick in but has a longer lasting role, is part of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, also called the HPA Axis. This part of the stress response occurs when the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, also called CRH. This gets to the pituitary gland, where it causes the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropin hormone, also called ACTH. Now that travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex, which is also referred to as the adrenal glands, and it takes about 10 to 15 seconds. When it gets there, it causes them to start releasing glucocorticoids. The most famous of these is, of course, cortisol. So these glucocorticoids begin working more slowly. It takes minutes for them to be released, but they last much longer than epinephrine and norepinephrine. They last a couple of hours. The hypothalamus also releases at least 30 other stress hormones, including vasopressin, oxytocin, and prolactin. The adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids in response to a stressor as part of the HPA axis. But what are these? As I mentioned, one of them is cortisol, but there are others, and they are steroid hormones, and they act during stress in a way similar to epinephrine, but they do it more slowly, as I mentioned before, than epinephrine, and they last longer. One of the important things glucocorticoids do is increase the amount of calcium that enters neurons. Now recall that neurons communicate by releasing neurotransmitters into a synapse where they cross over to the postsynaptic neurons' receptors to bind with those receptors and communicate that signal. But the amount of neurotransmitter released by the presynaptic neuron is dependent on the amount of calcium that is able to enter that presynaptic neuron to free up those neurotransmitters. Now, glucocorticoids increase that amount of calcium that's available. So they increase the amount of neurotransmitter that's released, and this helps to produce extra vigilance and arousal during stress. The epinephrine and norepinephrine work more effectively because there's more of it. The last thing that glucocorticoids do in the stress response is they help to increase stored energy to mobilize it for use during that stressful situation. In the beginning of the stress response, when you first perceive that threat, whatever it is, it's the amygdala that's signaling that starts the stress response in motion. And it does this by signaling to the hypothalamus. It signals to the hypothalamus to start the stress response by releasing CRH. But the amygdala is not the only part of the brain that can exercise some power over this stress response in the HPA axis. Remember, the brain, especially the limbic system and its emotional parts, is composed of many, many feedback loops. And those loops help to regulate emotional responses and emotional memories. The hippocampus can also regulate the HPA axis. It has receptors for glucocorticoids, so it's part of that feedback loop. It can signal back to the hypothalamus to slow down or even stop the release of CRH if there's too many glucocorticoids. The autonomic nervous system can also influence the functioning of the HPA axis and the stress response. There is sort of an anxiety feedback loop, such that the amygdala gets the sympathetic nervous system going, and then the aroused and activated sympathetic nervous system can feed back to the amygdala. So the anxiety, in a way, feeds on itself. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system, the relax and restore part of the autonomic nervous system, can also exercise a little power and control as well. It can work to deactivate the amygdala and reduce the anxiety. So these are just a few of the circuits that can exercise control over that HPA axis. As I mentioned before, the stress response worked great for humans long ago because when the threat was a temporary one, like running from a stampeding elephant, as soon as the threat was over, assuming you escaped, of course, the parasympathetic nervous system would come online, calming you down and returning you to your normal homeostatic state. So the stress response was positive and adaptive. That increased adrenaline made you run faster or scream louder or fight harder, and this made it easier for you to survive. The glucocorticoids worked to help conserve and create energy for the important task of eliminating that stressor. But the stressors of our age are not the same as they experienced in the African savanna. They tend to be much more frequent and last much longer, and as a result, our stress response has become chronically activated. We are really not well equipped for modern stressors. And as a result, chronic stress activation has had some really serious effects on health. For example, increased blood pressure as a result of sympathetic nervous system activation has led to higher risk of heart disease and stroke. The walls of your blood vessels are continuously stressed and stretched from higher pressure of blood. When your blood pressure goes up, it creates a higher pressure and it stretches those walls. And they begin to develop microscopic tears. So immune cells begin to fill those tears. And higher levels of epinephrine that are released during the stress response tend to increase the clotting of blood cells. That, combined with cholesterol circulating in your blood, begins to plug up those tears with gunky plaque, making it even worse. Eventually you have clogged arteries. Chronic stress also leads to exhaustion, mood disruptions, and potentially depression, not to mention anxiety, and it also compromises our immune systems. We know the hippocampus is important in the formation of new memories, and so as a result, chronic stress can lead to poorer learning and memory ability. So long-term stress makes you stupid. Not only that, long-term chronic stress also appears to be related to unhealthy brain aging that sets a person up for a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Some of the research findings for brain damage related to stress include the volume or size of the hippocampus has been shown to be smaller for chronically stressed Vietnam veterans, and in 9/11, people who were near the Twin Towers when the disaster struck had fewer neurons in their cerebral cortex overall. Here's an example of the effects of stress on the hippocampus in monkeys. On the left is the hippocampus of the control monkey. The blue arrow is pointing to a row of healthy neurons in the hippocampus. On the right, you can clearly see that the neurons in that same area are greatly reduced in the hippocampus of the monkey who was chronically stressed. So here you can clearly see the effect of chronic stress on neurons in the hippocampus. But not everyone responds the same way to stress. It appears that early developmental experiences have an effect on the stress responses of individuals when they become adults. For example, an early study found that rat pups who were held as pups were less susceptible to stress as adults. But later research has suggested that it wasn't that the rats were somehow protected from adult stress by being handled early in life. It may actually have been the response of the mother rat when they were returned to the nest that may have made a difference. The mother rats comforted their pups with lots of licking and grooming. It's thought that that extra attention may have caused an epigenetic effect, in that it may have caused a long-term effect on the expression of the genes related to the stress response in those rats, making them less sensitive to stress as adults. A similar phenomenon has been observed for humans. Examination of suicide victims has shown that the brains of those who were abused as children show differences in stress hormone receptors from those of non-abused children, suggesting that early abuse created an epigenetic change in areas particularly responsive to stress hormones. Also, as I mentioned before, recent studies have indicated that a person's beliefs about the effects of stress can also determine whether stress will have a harmful effect. Those who did not believe that stress was harmful to one's health did not show detrimental effects. Another thing that can buffer a person from the harmful effects of stress is oxytocin. Recently, oxytocin, which is released by touching, hugging, social interaction, sexual behavior, and even petting your cat or dog, has been shown to be protective against the harmful effects of stress, especially the cardiovascular effects. Next, I'll be talking about anxiety and anxiety disorders. So anxiety is a strongly negative emotion, and it arises in the anticipation of a fearful or threatening stimulus. Now notice I said it arises in the anticipation of the stimulus, the fearful stimulus, because anxiety is not generated from fear of something that's real. And in fact, fear and anxiety are very different. Both of those emotions are very adaptive. They provide useful information that we need to avoid potentially harmful consequences like getting bitten by a snake. So we see a poisonous snake in the middle of a field, and suddenly we feel afraid, knowing it could potentially kill us. And that experience is the experience of fear, because there is an actual threat. You see the snake, and you experience the fear. So the next time we were in that field, near the place where we saw the snake, we'll begin to experience a similar fear, a fearful feeling, but it isn't actually fear, because it's stemming from the idea that that snake could be lurking there again. The feeling that you're experiencing in this case is anxiety. Fear is very adaptive because it keeps us safe and out of harm from things that could potentially kill us or hurt us. And anxiety is also adaptive because it reminds us to avoid areas where there are creatures and things that are potentially very harmful to us. Even though anxiety sometimes is an emotion that is uncomfortable to feel, we would be unable to survive without ever experiencing anxiety. When I was choosing a picture of snakes to put on this slide, I was experiencing that anxiety because they're scary and they're something you really do want to avoid. However, excessive, overwhelming, or unrealistic anxiety, such as that experienced by people with anxiety disorders, can be very detrimental. So anxiety disorders are more common than depression. In fact, approximately 30% of the population will experience an anxiety disorder during their lifetime. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that anxiety disorders affect 40 million Americans each year. So there are several different anxiety disorders, and I won't cover all of them. The most common in the United States are generalized anxiety disorder, and that's where an individual feels extreme anxiety and worry that appears to pervade that person's entire life. And it doesn't seem to relate to any just one particular thing. People with this kind of anxiety disorder feel anxious just getting through the day. Obsessive compulsive disorder is another anxiety disorder, but this disorder includes compulsive thoughts and then rituals that attempt to calm or quell that anxiety that those thoughts create. Unfortunately, those rituals rarely provide any relief from that anxiety, and the cycle of the compulsive thoughts and the ritual behavior continues. Panic disorder is another common anxiety disorder, and it results in an overwhelming sense of crisis that causes the sympathetic nervous system to activate itself into overdrive to the extent that the person feels extreme and paralyzing fear. So this often includes a physical reaction that can even feel like having a heart attack. Panic attacks are one aspect of panic disorder. Panic disorder can be so debilitating that people become afraid to leave their homes because they're afraid that they will experience that overwhelming sense of panic or have a panic attack. Social anxiety disorder, or social phobia, is a strong fear of being judged by other people and feelings of embarrassment, or the potential that you will feel very embarrassed by judgment of other people. This anxiety is experienced not just when you're in a social situation, but when you think about a social situation, often for days or weeks before you're even in that situation. So this is another disorder that is often so severe, it prevents people from doing their regular activities of going to school or work or socializing. The last anxiety disorder that I'll talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is extreme anxiety that stems directly from the experience of a physical or emotional trauma. Now, who ends up suffering from anxiety disorders? Well, there appears to be a strong link to the genes. Although it's not specific for each of the disorders, this predisposition is for experiencing an anxiety disorder in general, rather than one of those specific subtypes. And families who have a stronger predisposition for these disorders are the same families who are predisposed to developing depression. Anxiety and depression are correlated, and they may share similar underlying genetics. Although anxiety and depression don't always occur together, and they don't always occur to the same extent. There are sex differences in anxiety disorders. Women are diagnosed with anxiety disorders more often than men for all of the anxiety disorders except for social anxiety or social phobia. For social anxiety disorder, men and women have similar rates of the disorder. So how does anxiety happen? Well, fear and anxiety are two different things, as I mentioned. And fear is an emotional response to an actual threat or danger in the environment. Anxiety, on the other hand, is an emotional response to the anticipation of danger or threat. Robert Sapolsky argues that most things we become anxious about, other than things that are innate, like falling or snakes or spiders or being suffocated, are learned. So going to the dentist, for example, includes hearing that awful aversive drilling noise, and sometimes that includes pain if you have to have the drill used on you. There's the smells and the sounds. And so when you're at the dentist, you experience the autonomic arousal of having the drill in your mouth and potentially feeling any pain. And the thoughts of the dentist become paired with that autonomic experience of going to the dentist and sitting in the chair and hearing and experiencing the drill and all of the other nervous system activation that goes along with a dentist visit. So you leave the dentist, but the next time you think of the dentist, this learned association creates this feeling of discomfort or anxiety, including all that sympathetic nervous system arousal that you experienced while you were there. And whenever the subject of the dentist is brought up, you experience those feelings, those autonomic nervous system responses, and that anticipation of that discomfort. It's no wonder that there's an urban legend that dentists have the highest suicide rate of professionals when just thinking about them makes a person feel bad. Anxiety disorders are a result of cognitive distortion. So they're similar to depression in that sense. It's the idea that a situation or an object is far more dangerous or threatening than it really is. The danger or threat becomes grossly overestimated, and even when the person is cognitively aware that their thinking on this is distorted, they still can't stop that feeling, that dread feeling of anxiety. So what is the cause of anxiety disorders? Everyone experiences anxiety, but why is anxiety more manageable for some and not others? So anxiety and a predisposition to experiencing anxiety disorders may be related to activity in the GABA receptors. So if you recall, GABA is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And a class of drugs called benzodiazepines increases the sensitivity of those GABA receptors. Those GABA receptors are all over the brain, in the cortex, also in the hippocampus and the amygdala. Increasing the sensitivity of those receptors then increases the amount of GABA that the brain can use, and as a result, it increases inhibition, which actually reduces the experience of anxiety. That is why these drugs, the benzodiazepines, which include Valium and Xanax, to name a couple, are commonly given to people with anxiety because they have a calming and sedating effect, because they inhibit. This connection between anxiety and GABA receptors has led to the hypothesis that anxiety may be related to a deficit in GABA receptors. Anxiety has also been related to other neurotransmitter levels in the brain. For example, serotonin. There's some evidence that excessively anxious people may have low activity of serotonin synapses. And when people with anxiety disorders are given SSRIs, which increase the amount of serotonin in the synapses, it reduces their anxiety. So there's the hypothesis that low serotonin is what creates anxiety. So more recently, another potential neurotransmitter has been proposed as a factor in developing anxiety disorders. And this one is glutamate. So recent research has investigated glutamate as being a master switch that is important in changing neural connections in the brain. So stress, especially chronic stress, appears to dramatically increase glutamate release in the limbic system, and studies show that large increases of glutamate in the limbic system as a result of stress can deteriorate the limbic system structures. This deterioration can lead to disruptions and faulty communication between limbic system circuits. And also, it's believed that it's the disruptions in the connections and in the circuits of the limbic system that lead to mental illness, such as anxiety disorders. Add this to the evidence that chronic stress is strongly related to anxiety disorders, and it's been suggested that stress may lay the groundwork for anxiety disorders to occur. Having excess glutamate damaging the limbic system and disrupting those circuits may be one of the reasons why anxiety disorders happen. And let's not forget that chronically experienced anxiety also evokes huge amounts of stress on the body. So it becomes a vicious feedback cycle of stress leading to anxiety, which in turn can lead to more stress. Remember, in the HPA axis, anxiety can feed on itself when the sympathetic nervous system arousal feeds back on the amygdala, and the amygdala reacts to that high level of sympathetic nervous system arousal. It may be that when anxiety starts to feed on itself, for people that are predisposed to anxiety disorders, there are disruptions in the connections in place. For example, the frontal lobe, which can inhibit sympathetic nervous system response, may be less able to inhibit the stress response or to calm it down. And this is consistent with many studies that indicate that chronic stress predisposes a person for anxiety disorders. It may be that stress-related increases in glutamate do enough damage to create the perfect conditions for an anxiety disorder to happen. And along this line, very recent studies show that drugs that alter glutamate processes can greatly reduce anxiety and the experience of anxiety disorders. So the one anxiety disorder that I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about is PTSD. And PTSD is unfortunately becoming more and more common and more of a social issue as a result of soldiers returning from war. But it's not only soldiers who are affected. A person can develop PTSD after witnessing an intense or especially traumatic or awful event, including abusive violence and or death, such as sudden death of a close friend, rape, torture, kidnapping. So in PTSD, memories of the horrible events intrude into consciousness and produce those same visceral feelings of arousal, that extreme fear, the trembling, that massive autonomic sympathetic nervous system activation that the original event caused. These memories are cued during stressful situations and even by harmless stimuli in the environment that sound similar or look similar or smell similar to those conditions involved in the traumatic event. And as a result, a person with PTSD eventually becomes hypervigilant, ever watchful, and easily fearful. This has also been called shell shock or combat fatigue. It's estimated that at least a third of all veterans suffer from PTSD, and sadly, many never obtain treatment. Other symptoms of PTSD, other than the emotional hypervigilance and overarousal, are memory loss, such as amnesia for some aspects of the traumatic event or the events, flashbacks, and short-term memory loss. There are also physical effects on the brain as well. So the memory deficits that occur with PTSD suggest that the hippocampus is involved in this disorder, and this is what researchers have found. Those with PTSD tend to have a smaller right hippocampus. You can see the hippocampus is outlined in red in these two pictures. The individual who does not have PTSD is on the left, and the individual with PTSD is on the right. Notice the volume is smaller. In addition to these volume differences, it's also apparent from studies that the activation of the hippocampus in response to stimuli that are fearful, like fearful faces, is also different for PTSD sufferers. PTSD sufferers show lower activation in the amygdala. So, however, these results are somewhat inconclusive because twin studies have shown that the smaller hippocampal volume for people with PTSD may have actually existed prior to the traumatic experience and prior to the development of PTSD. And so if that's the case, one interpretation could be that a smaller hippocampus will predispose you to getting PTSD if exposed to a traumatic event. So one of the models for the development of PTSD is that it develops as a result of fear conditioning and something that goes awry in fear conditioning. So during the stress response, the amygdala alerts the HPA axis. The hypothalamus signals to the brainstem to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system then is active. It releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. At the same time, the hypothalamus alerts the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which travels to the adrenal glands, where after a short period of time it starts releasing glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. Now, glucocorticoids do different things in the body that we've talked about during the stress response, but one of the things that they do is they bind with receptors in the hippocampus, and that allows the enhancement of the consolidation of memories with emotion. And in the case of PTSD, this is where the memory consolidation is thought to go wrong. So it's in the binding of the glucocorticoids to receptors in the hippocampus that usually helps us enhance a memory by combining the emotional feedback from the body and the amygdala with the traumatic event that impairment happens. So the fear and the extreme trauma that happened during the event gets somehow attached to all kinds of other stuff related to that event, like the situation or the environment or the sounds or the smells, to the same degree that it is related to the actual traumatic event. Now, this is something called hypermnesia. Hypermnesia is an impairment in memory. And it's similar to amnesia, but instead of the inability to remember, the hyperamnesia involved in PTSD is when everything about the event is remembered, even the unimportant things. It's when everything about a traumatic event is remembered and attached with that same fear and extreme terror and trauma that the actual traumatic event elicited. So recent research has indicated that the use of beta blockers and other medications that reduce that bodily arousal, that autonomic nervous system activity, within a few hours after a traumatic event, show promise in reducing the potential of developing PTSD. So somehow blocking the stress response, blocking the sympathetic nervous system, allows the amygdala and the hippocampus to properly combine the emotional significance of the traumatic event without including all of the irrelevant details that are usually included in PTSD and that elicit extreme emotional reactions, fear, terror, whenever anything cues those details. So it's thought that one of the reasons for this is because memory is enhanced during consolidation by the state of your body, your autonomic arousal, that feedback that you get. And that feedback, that arousal, is important information that the hippocampus puts into the memory so that we can keep track of that for later if that ever comes up again. The problem in hyperamnesia is that many things that are unrelated but were present during the traumatic event, tend to also be associated with and have that same emotional significance as the traumatic event itself did. So there's this inability to parse out the important aspect of the trauma, the traumatic event itself, with the unimportant details that surrounded the trauma, because the emotional fear and bodily reaction is attached to everything rather than just that one event. And this is thought to be a result of this infusion, this massive infusion of glucocorticoids that happens during the stress response to a really traumatic event. Somehow, the binding of the glucocorticoids with the hippocampus results in memory consolidation that makes it very difficult to identify the correct source of the threat. And what ends up happening is that any cue that reminds the person of that traumatic memory, even if it's something that's very distant or peripheral to the event, evokes that emotional fear and extreme response. And that's the end of this lecture.